Chapter 25. Wishes of Tinder, the Loosing of Stays. When Hurstwood got back to his office again, he was in a greater quandary than ever. Lord, he thought, what had he got into? How could things have taken such a violent turn and so quickly? He could hardly realize how it had all come about. It seemed a monstrous, unnatural, unwarranted condition which had suddenly descended upon him without his let or hindrance. Meanwhile, he gave a thought now and then to Carrie. What could be the trouble in that quarter? No letter had come, no word of any kind, and yet here it was late in the evening, and she had agreed to meet him that morning. Tomorrow they were to have met and gone off. Where? He saw that in the excitement of recent events he had not formulated a plan upon that score. He was desperately in love and would have taken great chances to win her under ordinary circumstances. But now what? Supposing she had found out something. Supposing she too wrote him and told him that she knew all, that she would have nothing more to do with him. It would be just like this to happen as things were going now. Meanwhile, he had not sent the money. He strolled up and down the polished floor of the resort, his hands in his pockets, his brow wrinkled, his mouth set. He was getting some vague comfort out of a good cigar, but it was no panacea for the ill which affected him. Every once in a while he would clench his fingers and tap his foot, signs of the stirring mental process he was undergoing. His whole nature was vigorously and powerfully shaken up, and he was finding what limits the mind has to endurance. He drank more brandy and soda than he had any evening in months. He was altogether a fine example of great mental perturbation. For all his study, nothing came of the evening except this. He sent the money. It was with great opposition after 2 or 3 hours of the most urgent mental affirmation and denial that at last he got an envelope, placed in it the requested amount, and slowly sealed it up. Then he called Harry, the boy of all work around the place. "You take this to this address," he said, handing him the envelope, "and give it to Mrs. Hurstwood." "Yes, sir," said the boy. "If she isn't there, bring it back." "Yes, sir." "You've seen my wife?" he asked as a precautionary measure as the boy turned to go. "Oh, yes, sir, I know her." "All right now, hurry right back." "Any answer?" "I guess not." The boy hastened away, and the manager fell to his musings. Now he had done it. There was no use speculating over that. He was beaten for tonight, and he might just as well make the best of it. But oh, the wretchedness of being forced this way. He could see her meeting the boy at the door and smiling sardonically. She would take the envelope and know that she had triumphed. If he only had that letter back, he wouldn't send it. He breathed heavily and wiped the moisture from his face. For relief, he arose and joined in conversation with a few friends who were drinking. He tried to get the interest of things about him, but it was not to be. All the time, his thoughts would run out to his home and the scene being therein enacted. All the time he was wondering what she would say when the boy handed her the envelope. In about an hour and 3/4, the boy returned. He had evidently delivered the package, for, as he came up, he made no sign of taking anything out of his pocket. "Well," said Hurstwood, "I gave it to her." "My wife?" "Yes, sir." "Any answer?" "She said it was high time." Hurstwood scowled fiercely. There was no more to be done upon that score that night. He went on brooding over his situation until midnight, when he repaired again to the Palmer house. He wondered what the morning would bring forth and slept anything but soundly upon it. Next day he went again to the office and opened his mail. suspicious and hopeful of its contents. No word from Carrie, nothing from his wife, which was pleasant. The fact that he had sent the money and that she had received it worked to ease of his mind, whereas the thought that he had done it receded, his chagrin at it grew less, and his hope of peace more. He fancied, as he sat at his desk, that nothing would be done for a week or two. Meanwhile, he would have time to think. This process of thinking began by a reversion to Carrie and to the arrangement by which he was to get her away from Drouet. How about that now? His pain at her failure to meet or write him rapidly increased as he devoted himself to this subject. He decided to write her care of the West Side Post Office and ask for an explanation, as well as to have her meet him. The thought that this letter would probably not reach her until Monday chafed him exceedingly. He must get some speedier method, but how? He thought upon it for a half-hour, not contemplating a messenger or a cab direct to the house, owing to the exposure of it, but finding that time was slipping away to no purpose. He wrote the letter and then began to think again. The hours slipped by, and with them the possibility of the union he had contemplated. He had thought to be joyously aiding Carrie by now in the task of joining her interests to his, and here it was afternoon and nothing done. 3 o'clock came, 4, 5, 6, and no letter. The helpless manager paced the floor and grimly endured the gloom of defeat. He saw a busy Saturday ushered out, the Sabbath in, and nothing done. All day, the bar being closed, he brooded alone, shut out from home, from the excitement of his resort, from Carrie, and without the ability to alter his condition one iota. It was the worst Sunday he had spent in his life. In Monday's second mail, he encountered a very legal-looking letter which held his interest for some time. It bore the imprint of the law offices of McGregor, James, and Hay, and with a very formal "Dear Sir" and "We beg to state," went on to inform him briefly that they had been retained by Mrs. Julia Hurstwood to adjust certain matters which related to her sustenance and property rights, and would he kindly call and see them about the matter at once. He read it through carefully several times and then merely shook his head. It seemed as if his family troubles were just beginning. "Well," he said after a time, quite audibly, "I don't know." Then he folded it up and put it in his pocket. To add to his misery, there was no word from Carrie. He was quite certain now that she knew he was married and was angered at his perfidy. His loss seemed all the more bitter now that he needed her most. He thought he would go out and insist on seeing her if she did not send him word of some sort soon. He was really affected most miserably of all by this desertion. He had loved her earnestly enough, but now that the possibility of losing her stared him in the face, she seemed much more attractive. He really pined for a word, and looked out upon her with his mind's eye in the most wistful manner. He did not propose to lose her, whatever she might think. Come what might, he would adjust this matter, and soon. He would go to her and tell her all his family complications. He would explain to her just where he stood and how much he needed her. Surely she couldn't go back on him now. It wasn't possible. He would plead until her anger would melt, until she would forgive him. Suddenly, he thought, supposing she isn't out there. Suppose she has gone. He was forced to take his feet. It was too much to think of and sit still. Nevertheless, his rousing availed him nothing. On Tuesday it was the same way. He did manage to bring himself into the mood to go out to Carrie, but when he got in Ogden Place, he thought he saw a man watching him and went away. He did not go within a block of the house. One of the galling incidents of this visit was that he came back on a Randolph streetcar, and without noticing arrived almost opposite the building of the concern with which his son was connected. This sent a pang through his heart. He had called on his boy there several times. Now the lad had not sent him a word. Now the lad had not sent him a word. His absence did not seem to be noticed by either of his children. Well, well, fortune plays a man queer tricks. He got back to his office and joined in a conversation with friends. It was as if idle chatter deadened the sense of misery. That night, he dined at Rector's and returned at once to his office. And the bustle and show of the latter was his only relief. He troubled over many little details and talked perfunctorily to everybody. He stayed at his desk long after all others had gone and only quitted it when the night watchman on his round pulled at the front door to see if it was safely locked. On Wednesday, he received a polite note from McGregor, James, and Hay. It read, "Dear Sir, we begin to inform you that we are instructed to wait until tomorrow, Thursday, at 1 o'clock, before filing suit against you, on behalf of Mrs. Julia Hurstwood, for divorce and alimony. If we do not hear from you before that time, we shall consider that you do not wish to compromise the matter in any way and act accordingly. Very truly yours, etc." "Compromise!" exclaimed Hurstwood bitterly. "Compromise!" Again he shook his head. So here it was spread out clear before him, and now he knew what to expect. If he didn't go and see them, they would sue him promptly. If he did, he would be offered terms that would make his blood boil. He folded the letter and put it with the other one. Then he put on his hat and went for a turn about the block. Chapter 26. The Ambassador Fallen, A Search for the Gate. Carrie, left alone by Drouet, listened to his retreating steps, scarcely realizing what had happened. She knew that he had stormed out. It was some moments before she questioned whether he would return, not now exactly, but ever. She looked around her upon the rooms out of which the evening light was dying, and wondered why she did not feel quite the same towards them. She went over to the dresser and struck a match, lighting the gas. Then she went back to the rocker to think. It was some time before she could collect her thoughts, but when she did, this truth began to take on importance. She was quite alone. Suppose Drouet did not come back. Suppose she should never hear anything more of him. This fine arrangement of chambers would not last long. She would have to quit them. To her credit, be it said, she never once counted on Hurstwood. She could only approach that subject with a pang of sorrow and regret. For a truth, she was rather shocked and frightened by this evidence of human depravity. He would have tricked her without turning an eyelash. She would have been led into a newer and worse situation. And yet she could not keep out the pictures of his looks and manners. Only this one deed seemed strange and miserable. It contrasted sharply with all she felt and knew concerning the man. But she was alone. That was the greater thought just at present. How about that? Would she go out to work again? Would she begin to look around in the business district? The stage. Oh yes, Drouet had spoken about that. Was there any hope there? She moved to and fro in deep and varied thoughts, while the minutes slipped away and night fell completely. She had had nothing to eat, and yet there she sat, thinking it over. She remembered that she was hungry and went to the little cupboard in the rear room where were the remains of one of their breakfasts. She looked at these things with certain misgivings. The contemplation of food had more significance than usual. While she was eating, she began to wonder how much money she had. It struck her as exceedingly important, and without ado she went to look for her purse. It was on the dresser, and in it were $7 in bills and some change. She quailed as she thought of the insignificance of the amount and rejoiced because the rent was paid until the end of the month. She began also to think what she would have done if she had gone out into the street when she first started. By the side of that situation, as she looked at it now, the present seemed agreeable. She had a little time at least, and then perhaps everything would come out all right after all. Drouet had gone, but what of it? He did not seem seriously angry. He only acted as if he were huffy. He would come back, of course he would. There was his cane in the corner. Here was one of his collars. He had left his light overcoat in the wardrobe. She looked about and tried to assure herself with the sight of a dozen such details. But alas, the secondary thought arrived. Supposing he did come back, then what? Here was another proposition nearly, if not quite as disturbing. She would have to talk with and explain to him. He would want her to admit that he was right. It would be impossible for her to live with him. On Friday, Carrie remembered her appointment with Hurstwood, and the passing of the hour when she should, by all right of promise, have been in his company, served to keep the calamity which had befallen her exceedingly fresh and clear. In her nervousness and stress of mind, she felt it necessary to act, and consequently put on a brown street dress, and at 11 o'clock started to visit the business portion once again. She must look for work. The rain, which threatened at 12 and began at 1, served equally well to cause her to retrace her steps and remain within doors as it did to reduce Hurstwood's spirits and give him a wretched day. The morrow was Saturday, a half-holiday in many business quarters, and besides it was a balmy, radiant day, with the trees and grass shining exceedingly green after the rain of the night before. When she went out, the sparrows were twittering merrily in joyous choruses. She could not help feeling, as she looked across the lovely park, that life was a joyous thing for those who did not need to worry. And she wished over and over that something might interfere now to preserve for her the comfortable state which she had occupied. She did not want Drouet or his money when she thought of it, nor anything more to do with Hurstwood, but only the content and ease of mind she had experienced. For after all, she had been happier at least than she was now when confronted by the necessity of making her way alone. When she arrived in the business part, it was quite 11 o'clock, and the business had little longer to run. She did not realize this at first, being affected by some of the old distress which was a result of her earlier adventure into this strenuous and exacting quarter. She wandered about, assuring herself that she was making up her mind to look for something, and at the same time feeling that perhaps it was not necessary to be in such haste about it. The thing was difficult to encounter, and she had a few days. Besides, she was not sure that she was really face to face again with the bitter problem of self-sustenance. Anyhow, there was one change for the better. She knew that she had improved in appearance. Her manner had vastly changed. Her clothes were becoming, and men, well-dressed men, some of the kind who before had gazed at her indifferently from behind their polished railings and imposing office partitions, now gazed into her face with a soft light in their eyes. In a way, she felt the power and satisfaction of the thing, but it did not wholly reassure her. She looked for nothing save what might legitimately and without the appearance of special favor. What might come legitimately and without this appearance of special favor. She wanted something, but no man should buy her by false protestations or favor. She proposed to earn her living honestly. This store closes at 1 on Saturdays was a pleasing and satisfactory legend to see upon doors which she felt she ought to enter and inquire for work. It gave her an excuse, and after encountering quite a number of them and noting that the clock registered 12:15, she decided that it would be no use to seek further today. So she got on a car and went to Lincoln Park. There was always something to see there: the flowers, the animals, the lake, and she flattered herself that on Monday she would be up betimes and searching. Besides, many things might happen between now and Monday. Sunday passed with equal doubts, worries, assurances, and heaven knows what vagaries of mind and spirit. Every half hour in the day the thought would come to her most sharply, like the tail of a swishing whip, that action, immediate action, was imperative. At other times she would look about her and assure herself that things were not so bad, that certainly she would come out safe and sound. At such times she would think of Drouet's advice about going on the stage, and saw some chance for herself in that quarter. She decided to take up that opportunity on the morrow. Accordingly, she arose early Monday morning and dressed herself carefully. She did not know just how such applications were made, but she took it to be a matter which related more directly to the theater buildings. All you had to do was to inquire of someone about the theater for the manager and ask for a position. If there was anything, you might get it, or at least he could tell you how. She had had no experience with this class of individuals whatsoever, and did not know the salacity and humor of the theatrical tribe. She only knew of the position which Mr. Hale occupied. But, of all things, she did not wish to encounter that personage, on account of her intimacy with his wife. There was, however, at this time, one theater, the Chicago Opera House, which was considerably in the public eye, and its manager, David A. Henderson, had a fair local reputation. Carrie had seen one or two elaborate performances there, and had heard of several others. She knew nothing of Henderson, nor of the methods of applying, but she instinctively felt that this would be a likely place, and accordingly strolled about in that neighborhood. She came bravely enough to the showy entranceway, with a polished and begilded lobby, set with framed pictures out of the current attraction, leading up to the quiet box office. But she could get no further. A noted comic opera comedian was holding forth that week, and the air of distinction and prosperity overawed her. She could not imagine that there would be anything in such a lofty sphere for her. She almost trembled at the audacity which might have carried her on a terrible rebuff. She could find heart only to look at the pictures which were showy and then walk out. It seemed to her as if she had made a splendid escape, and that it would be foolhardy to think of applying in that quarter again. This little experience settled her hunting for one day. She looked around elsewhere, but it was from the outside. She got the location of several playhouses fixed in her mind, notably the Grand Opera House and McVicker's, both of which were leading in attractions, and then came away. Her spirits were materially reduced, owing to the newly restored sense of magnitude of the great interests and the insignificance of her claims upon society, such as she understood them to be. That night she was visited by Mrs. Hale, whose chatter and protracted stay made it impossible to dwell upon her predicament or the fortune of the day. Before retiring, however, she sat down to think, and gave herself up to the most gloomy forebodings. Drouet had not put in an appearance. She had had no word from any quarter. She had spent $1 of her precious sum in procuring food and paying car fare. It was evident that she would not endure long. Besides, she had discovered no resource. In this situation her thoughts went out to her sister in Van Buren Street, whom she had not seen since the night of her flight, and to her home at Columbia City, which seemed now a part of something that could not be again. She looked for no refuge in that direction. Nothing but sorrow was brought her by thoughts of Hurstwood, which would return. That he could have chosen to dupe her in so ready a manner seemed a cruel thing. Tuesday came, and with it appropriate indecision and speculation. She was in no mood, after her failure of the day before, to hasten forth upon her work-seeking errand, and yet she rebuked herself for what she considered her weakness the day before. Accordingly, she started out to revisit the Chicago Opera House, but possessed scarcely enough courage to approach. She did manage to inquire at the box office, however. "Manager of the company or the house?" asked the smartly dressed individual who took care of the tickets. He was favorably impressed by Carrie's looks. "I don't know," said Carrie, taken aback by the question. "You couldn't see the manager of the house today anyhow," volunteered the young man. "He's out of town." He noted her puzzled look and then added, "What is it you wish to see about?" "I want to see about getting a position," she answered. "You'd better see the manager of the company," he returned, "but he isn't here now." "When will he be in?" asked Carrie, somewhat relieved by this information. "Well, you might find him in between 11 and 12. He's here after 2 o'clock. Carrie thanked him and walked out, while the young man gazed after her through one of the side windows of his gilded coupe. "Good looking," he said to himself, and proceeded to visions of condescensions on her part which were exceedingly flattering to himself. One of the principal comedy companies of the day was playing an engagement at the Grand Opera House. Here, Carrie asked to see the manager of the company. She little knew the trivial authority of this individual, or that had there been a vacancy, an actor would have been sent on from New York to fill it. "His office is upstairs," said a man in the box office. Several persons were in the manager's office, two lounging near a window, another talking to an individual sitting at a roll-top desk, the manager. Carrie glanced nervously about and began to fear that she should have to make her appeal before the assembled company, two of whom, the occupants of the window, were already observing her carefully. "I can't do it," the manager was saying. "It's a rule of Mr. Frohman's never to allow visitors back of the stage. No, no." Carrie timidly waited, standing. There were chairs, but no one motioned her to be seated. The individual to whom the manager had been talking went away quite crestfallen. That luminary gazed earnestly at some papers before him as if they were of the greatest concern. "Did you see that in the Herald this morning about Nat Goodwin, Harris?" "No," said the person addressed. What was it?" "Made quite a curtain address at Hooley's last night. Better look it up." Harris reached over to a table and began to look for the Herald. "What is it?" said the manager to Carrie, apparently noticing her for the first time. He thought he was going to be held up for free tickets. Carrie summoned up all her courage, which was little at best. She realized that she was a novice and felt as if a rebuff were certain. Of this, she was so sure that she only wished now to pretend she had called for advice. "Can you tell me how to go about getting on the stage?" It was the best way, after all, to have gone about the matter. She was interesting, in a manner, to the occupant of the chair, and the simplicity of her request and attitude took his fancy. He smiled, as did the others in the room, who, however, made some slight effort to conceal their humor. "I don't know," he answered, looking her brazenly over. "Have you ever had any experience upon the stage?" "A little," answered Carrie. "I have taken part in amateur performances." She thought she had to make some sort of showing in order to retain his interest. "Never studied for the stage?" he said, putting on an air intended as much to impress his friends with his discretion as Carrie. "No, sir." "Well, I don't know," he answered, tipping lazily back in his chair while she stood before him. "What makes you want to get on the stage?" She felt abashed at the man's daring, but could only smile in answer to his engaging smirk and say, "I need to make a living." "Oh," he answered, rather taken by her trim appearance, and feeling as if he might scrape up an acquaintance with her. "That's a good reason, isn't it? Well, Chicago is not a good place for what you want to do. You ought to be in New York. There's more chance there. You could hardly expect to get started out here." Carrie smiled genially, grateful that he should condescend to advise her even so much. He noticed the smile and put a slightly different construction on it. He thought he saw an easy chance for a little flirtation. "Sit down," he said, pulling a chair forward from the side of his desk and dropping his voice so that the two men in the room should not hear. Those two gave each other the suggestion of a wink. "Well, I'll be going, Barney," said one, breaking away and so addressing the manager. "See you this afternoon." "All right," said the manager. The remaining individual took up a paper as if to read. "Did you have any idea what sort of part you would like to get?" asked the manager softly. "Oh, no," said Carrie. "I would take anything to begin with." "I see," he said. "Do you live here in the city?" "Yes, sir." The manager smiled most blandly. "Have you ever tried to get in as a chorus girl?" he asked, assuming a more confidential air. Carrie began to feel that there was something exuberant and unnatural in his manner. "No," she said. "That's the way most girls begin," he went on, "who go on the stage. It's a good way to get experience." He was turning on her a glance of the companionable and persuasive manner. "I didn't know that," said Carrie. It's a difficult thing," he went on, "but there's always a chance, you know." Then, as if he suddenly remembered, he pulled out his watch and consulted it. "I have an appointment at 2:00, he said, "and I've got to go to lunch now. Would you care to come and dine with me? We can talk it over there." "Oh, no," said Carrie, the whole motive of the man flashing on her at once. "I have an engagement myself." "That's too bad," he said, realizing that he had been a little beforehand in his offer and that Carrie was about to go away. "Come in later. I may know of something." "Thank you," she answered, with some trepidation, and went out. "She was good-looking, wasn't she?" said the manager's companion, who had not caught all the details of the game he had played. "Yes, in a way," said the other, sore to think the game had been lost. "She'd never make an actress, though. Just another chorus girl, that's all." This little experience nearly destroyed her ambition to call upon the manager at the Chicago Opera House, but she decided to do so after a time. He was of a more sedate turn of mind. He said at once that there was no opening of any sort and seemed to consider her search foolish. "Chicago is no place to get a start," he said. "You ought to be in New York." Still she persisted, and went to McVicker's, where she could not find anyone. The old homestead was running there, but the person to whom she was referred was not to be found. These little expeditions took up her time until quite 4 o'clock, when she was weary enough to go home. She felt as if she ought to continue and inquire elsewhere, but the results so far were too dispiriting. She took the car and arrived at Ogden Place in 3/4 of an hour, but decided to ride on to the West Side branch of the post office, where she was accustomed to receive Hurstwood's letters. There was one there now, written Saturday, which she tore open and read with mingled feelings. There was so much warmth in it, and such tense complaint at her having failed to meet him, and her subsequent silence, that she rather pitied the man. That he loved her was evident enough. That he had wished and dared to do so, married as he was the evil. She felt as if the thing deserved an answer, and consequently decided that she would write and let him know that she knew of his married state, and was justly incensed at his deception. She would tell him that it was all over between them. At her room, the wording of this missive occupied her for some time, for she fell to the task at once. It was most difficult. "You do not need to have me explain why I did not meet you," she wrote in part. "How could you deceive me so? You cannot expect me to have anything more to do with you. I wouldn't under any circumstances. Oh, how could you act so?" she added in a burst of feeling. You have caused me more misery than you can think. I hope you will get over your infatuation for me. We must not meet any more. Goodbye." She took the letter the next morning, and at the corner dropped it reluctantly into the letter box, still uncertain as to whether she should do so or not. And she took the car and went downtown. This was the dull season with the department stores, but she was listened to with more consideration than was usually accorded to young women applicants, owing to her neat and attractive appearance. She was asked the same old questions with which she was already familiar. What can you do? Have you ever worked in a retail store before? Are you experienced? At the fair, C& Companies, and all the great stores, it was much the same. It was the dull season. She might come in a little later. Possibly they would like to have her. When she arrived at the house at the end of the day, weary and disheartened, she discovered that Drouet had been there. His umbrella and light overcoat were gone. She thought she missed other things, but could not be sure. Everything had not been taken. So his going was crystallizing into staying. What was she to do now? Evidently, she would be facing the world in the same old way within a day or two. Her clothes would get poor. She put her two hands together in her customary expressive way and pressed her fingers. Large tears gathered in her eyes and broke hot across her cheeks. She was alone, very much alone. Drouet really had called, but it was with a very different mind from that which Carrie had imagined. He expected to find her, to justify his return by claiming that he came to get the remaining portion of his wardrobe, and before he got away again to patch up a piece. Accordingly, when he arrived, he was disappointed to find Carrie out. He trifled about, hoping that she was somewhere in the neighborhood and would soon return. He constantly listened, expecting to hear her foot on the stair. When he did so, it was his intention to make believe that he had just come in and was disturbed at being caught. Then he would explain his need of clothes and find out how things stood. Wait as he did, however, Carrie did not come. From pottering around among the drawers in momentary expectation of her arrival, he changed to looking out of the window, and from that resting himself in the rocking chair. Still no Carrie. He began to grow restless and lit a cigar. After that he walked the floor. Then he looked out of the window and saw clouds gathering. He remembered an appointment at 3. He began to think that it would be useless to wait and got hold of his umbrella and light coat, intending to take these things anyway. It would scare her, he hoped. Tomorrow he would come back for the others. He would find out how things stood. As he started to go, he felt truly sorry that he had missed her. There was a little picture of her on the wall, showing her arrayed in the little jacket he had first bought her. Her face a little more wistful than he had seen it lately. He was really touched by it and looked into the eyes of it with a rather rare feeling for him. "You didn't do me right, Cad," he said, as if he were addressing her in the flesh. Then he went to the door, took a good look around, and went out. Chapter 27. When waters engulf us, we reach for a star. It was when he returned from his disturbed stroll about the streets, after receiving the decisive note from McGregor, James, and Hay, that Hurstwood found the letter Carrie had written him that morning. He thrilled intensely as he noted the handwriting and rapidly tore it open. Then, he thought, she loves me, or she would not have written to me at all. He was slightly depressed at the tenor of the note for the first few minutes, but soon recovered. She wouldn't write at all if she didn't care for me. This was his one resource against the depression which held him. He could extract little from the wording of the letter, but the spirit he thought he knew. There was really something exceedingly human, if not pathetic, in his being thus relieved by a clearly worded reproof. He who had for so long remained satisfied with himself now looked outside of himself for comfort, and to such a source. The mystic cords of affection, how they bind us all. The color came to his cheeks. For the moment he forgot the letter from McGregor, James, and Hay. If he could only have Carrie, perhaps he could get out of the whole entanglement. Perhaps it would not matter. He wouldn't care what his wife did with herself if only he might not lose Carrie. He stood up and walked about, dreaming his delightful dream of a life continued with this lovely possessor of his heart. It was not long, however, before the old worry was back for consideration, and with it, what weariness! He thought of the morrow and the suit. He had done nothing, and here was the afternoon slipping away. It was now 4:15. At 5 the attorneys would have gone home. He still had the morrow until noon. Even as he thought, the last 15 minutes passed away, and it was 5. Then he abandoned the thought of seeing them any more that day and turned to Carrie. It is to be observed that the man did not justify himself to himself. He was not troubling about that. His whole thought was the possibility of persuading Carrie. Nothing was wrong in that. He loved her dearly. Their mutual happiness depended upon it. Would that Drouet were only away! While he was thinking thus elatedly, he remembered that he wanted some clean linen in the morning. This he purchased together with a half-dozen ties and went to the Palmer house. As he entered, he thought he saw Drouet ascending the stairs with a key. Surely not Drouet. Then he thought perhaps they had changed their abode temporarily. He went straight up to the desk. "Is Mr. Drouet stopping here?" he asked of the clerk. "I think he is," said the latter, consulting his private registry list. "Yes." "Is that so?" exclaimed Hurstwood, otherwise concealing his astonishment. "Alone?" he added. "Yes," said the clerk. Hurstwood turned away and set his lips so as best to express and conceal his feelings. "How's that?" he thought. "They've had a row." He hastened to his room with rising spirits and changed his linen. As he did so, he made up his mind that if Carrie was alone, or if she had gone to another place, it behooved him to find out. He decided to call at once. "I know what I'll do," he thought. "I'll go to the door and ask if Mr. Drouet is at home. That will bring about whether he is there or not and where Carrie is." He was almost moved to some muscular display as he thought of it. He decided to go immediately after supper. On coming down from his room at 6, he looked carefully about to see if Drouet was present, and then went out to lunch. He could scarcely eat, however. He was so anxious to be about his errand. Before starting, he thought it well to discover where Drouet would be, and returned to his hotel. "Has Mr. Drouet gone out?" he asked of the clerk. "No," answered the latter. "He's in his room. Do you wish to send up a card?" "No, I'll call around later," answered Hurstwood, and strolled out. He took a Madison car and went direct to Ogden Place, this time walking boldly up to the door. The chambermaid answered his knock. "Is Mr. Drouet in?" said Hurstwood blandly. "He is out of the city," said the girl, who had heard Carrie tell this to Mrs. Hale. "Is Mrs. Drouet in?" "No, she has gone to the theater." "Is that so?" said Hurstwood, considerably taken aback. Then, as if burdened with something important, "You don't know to which theater?" The girl really had no idea where she had gone, but not liking Hurstwood and wishing to cause him trouble, answered, "Yes, Hooley's." "Thank you," returned the manager, and tipping his hat slightly, went away. "I'll look in at Hooley's," thought he. But as a matter of fact, he did not. Before he had reached the central portion of the city, he thought the whole matter over and decided it would be useless. As much as he longed to see Carrie, he knew she would be with someone and did not wish to intrude with his plea there. A little later he might do so, in the morning. Only in the morning he had the lawyer question before him. This little pilgrimage threw quite a wet blanket upon his rising spirits. He was soon down again to his old worry and reached the resort anxious to find relief. Quite a company of gentlemen were making the place lively with their conversation. A group of Cook County politicians were conferring about a round cherrywood table in the rear portion of the room. Several young merrymakers were chattering at the bar before making a belated visit to the theater. A shabbily genteel individual with a red nose and an old high hat was sipping a quiet glass of ale alone at one end of the bar. Hurstwood nodded to the politicians and went into his office. About 10 o'clock, a friend of his, Mr. Frank L. Tainter, a local sport and racing man, dropped in, and seeing Hurstwood alone in his office, came to the door. "Hello, George," he exclaimed. "How are you, Frank?" said Hurstwood, somewhat relieved by the sight of him. "Sit down." And he motioned him to one of the chairs in the little room. "What's the matter, George?" asked Tainter. "You look a little glum. Haven't lost at the track, have you?" "I'm not feeling very well tonight. I had a slight cold the other day." "Take whiskey, George," said Tainter. "You ought to know that." Hurstwood smiled. While they were still conferring there, several other of Hurstwood's friends entered, and not long after 11, the theaters being out, some actors began to drop in, among them some nobilities. Then began one of those pointless social conversations so common in American resorts, where the would-be gilded attempted to rub off guilt from those who have it in abundance. If Hurstwood had one leaning, it was toward notabilities. He considered that, if anywhere, he belonged among them. He was too proud to toady, too keen not to strictly observe the plane he occupied when there were those present who did not appreciate him. But in situations like the present, where he could shine as a gentleman and be received without equivocation as a friend and equal among men of known ability, he was most delighted. It was on such occasions, if ever, that he would take something. When the social flavor was strong enough, he would even unbend to the extent of drinking glass for glass with his associates. Punctiliously observing his turn to pay as if he were an outsider like the others. If he ever approached intoxication, or rather that ruddy warmth and comfortableness which precedes the more sloven state, it was when individuals such as these were gathered about him, when he was one of a circle of chatting celebrities. Tonight, disturbed as was his state, he was rather relieved to find company. And now that the notabilities were gathered, he laid aside his troubles for the nonce, and joined in right heartily. It was not long before the imbibing began to tell. Stories began to crop up, those ever-enduring droll stories which form the major portion of the conversation among American men under such circumstances. 12 o'clock arrived, the hour for closing, and with it the company took leave. Hurstwood shook hands with them most cordially. He was very roseate physically. He had arrived at that state where his mind, though clear, was nevertheless warm in its fancies. He felt as if his troubles were not very serious. Going into his office, he began to turn over certain accounts, awaiting the departure of the bartenders and the cashier, who soon left. It was the manager's duty, as well as his custom after all were gone, to see that everything was safely closed up for the night. As a rule, no money except the cash taken in after banking hours was kept about the place, and that was locked in the safe by the cashier, who, with the owners, was joint keeper of the secret combination. But nevertheless, Hurstwood nightly took the precaution to try the cash drawers and the safe in order to see that they were tightly closed. Then he would lock his own little office and set the proper light burning near the safe, after which he would take his departure. Never in his experience had he found anything out of order. But tonight, after shutting down his desk, he came out and tried the safe. His way was to give a sharp pull. This time the door responded. He was slightly surprised at that, and looking in found the money cases as left for the day, apparently unprotected. His first thought was, of course, to inspect the drawers and shut the door. I'll speak to Mayhew about this tomorrow, he thought. The latter had certainly imagined upon going out a half-hour before that he had turned the knob on the door so as to spring the lock. He had never failed to do so before. But tonight Mayhew had other thoughts. He had been revolving the problem of a business of his own. I'll look in here, thought the manager, pulling out the money drawers. He did not know why he wished to look in there. It was quite a superfluous action, which another time might not have happened at all. As he did so, a layer of bills and parcels of 1,000, such as banks issue, caught his eye. He could not tell how much they represented, but paused to view them. Then he pulled out the second of the cash drawers. In that were the receipts of the day. I didn't know Fitzgerald and Moy ever left any money this way, his mind said to itself. They must have forgotten it. He looked at the other drawer and paused again. Count them, said a voice in his ear. He put his hand into the first of the boxes and lifted the stack, letting the separate parcels fall. They were bills of $50 and $100 done in packages of 1,000. He thought he counted 10 such. Why don't I shut the safe? His mind said to itself, lingering. What makes me pause here? For answer there came the strangest words. Did you ever have $10,000 in ready money? Lo, the manager remembered that he had never had so much. All his property had been slowly accumulated, and now his wife owned that. He was worth more than 40,000 all told, but she would get that. He puzzled as he thought of these things, and pushed in the drawers and closed the door, pausing with his hand upon the knob, which might so easily lock it all beyond temptation. Still he paused. Finally, he went to the windows and pulled down the curtains. Then he tried the door, which he had previously locked. What was this thing making him suspicious? Why did he wish to move about so quietly? He came back to the end of the counter as if to rest his arm and think. Then he went and unlocked his little office door and turned on the light. He also opened his desk, sitting down before it only to think strange thoughts. The safe is open, said a voice. There is just the least little crack in it. The lock has not been sprung. The manager floundered among a jumble of thoughts. Now all the entanglement of the day came back. Also the thought that here was a solution. That money would do it. If he had that and Carrie. He rose up and stood stock still, looking at the floor. What about it? His mind asked. And for answer he put his hand slowly up and scratched his head. The manager was no fool to be led blindly away by such an errant proposition as this, but his situation was peculiar. Wine was in his veins. It had crept up into his head and given him a warm view of the situation. It also colored the possibilities of 10,000 for him. He could see great opportunity with that. He could get Carrie. Oh yes, he could. He could get rid of his wife. That letter, too, was waiting discussion tomorrow morning. He would not need to answer that. He went back to the safe and put his hand on the knob. Then he pulled the door open and took the drawer with the money quite out. With it once out and before him, it seemed a foolish thing to think about leaving it. Certainly it would. Why, he could live quietly with Carrie for years. Lord, what was that? For the first time he was tense, as if a stern hand had been laid upon his shoulder. He looked fearfully around. Not a soul was present, not a sound. Someone was shuffling by on the sidewalk. He took the box and the money and put it back in the safe, and he partly closed the door again. To those who have never wavered in conscience, The predicament of the individual whose mind is less strongly constituted and who trembles in the balance between duty and desire is scarcely appreciable, unless graphically portrayed. Those who have never heard the solemn voice of the ghostly clock which ticks with awful distinctness, "Thou shalt, thou shalt not, thou shalt, thou shalt not," are in no position to judge. Not alone in sensitive, highly organized natures is such a mental conflict possible. The dullest specimen of humanity, when drawn by desire toward evil, is recalled by a sense of right, which is proportionate in power and strength to his evil tendency. We must remember that it may not be a knowledge of right, for no knowledge of right is predicted of the animal's instinctive recoil at evil. Men are still led by instinct before they are regulated by knowledge. It is instinct which recalls the criminal. It is instinct, where highly organized reasoning is absent, which gives the criminal his feeling of danger, his fear of wrong. At every first adventure, then, into some untried evil, the mind wavers. The clock of thought ticks out its wish and its denial. To those who have never experienced such a mental dilemma, the following will appeal on the simple ground of revelation. When Hurstwood put the money back, his nature again resumed in ease and daring. No one had observed him. He was quite alone. No one could tell what he wished to do. He could work this thing out for himself. The imbibation of the evening had not yet worn off. Moist as was his brow, tremble as did his hand once after the nameless fright, he was still flushed with the fumes of liquor. He scarcely noticed that the time was passing. He went over his situation once again, his eye always seeing the money in a lump, his mind always seeing what it would do. He strolled into his little room, then to the door, then to the safe again. He put his hand on the knob and opened it. There was the money. Surely no harm could come from looking at it. He took out the drawer again and lifted the bills. They were so smooth, so compact, so portable. How little they made after all. He decided he would take them. Yes, he would. He would put them in his pocket. And he looked at that and saw they would not go there. His hand satchel. To be sure, his hand satchel. They would go in that. All of it would. No one would think anything of it either. He went into the little office and took it from the shelf in the corner. Now he set it upon his desk and went out toward the safe. For some reason, he did not want to fill it out in the big room. First, he brought the bills and then the loose receipts of the day. He would take it all. He put the empty drawers back and pushed the iron door almost to, then stood beside it meditating. The wavering of a mind under such circumstances is an almost inexplicable thing, and yet it is absolutely true. Hurstwood could not bring himself to act definitely. He wanted to think about it, to ponder over it, to decide whether it were best. He was drawn by such a keen desire for Carrie, driven by such a state of turmoil in his own affairs that he thought constantly it would be best, and yet he wavered. He did not know what evil might result from it to him, how soon he might come to grief. The true ethics of the situation never once occurred to him and never would have under any circumstances. After he had all the money in the handbag, a revulsion of feeling seized him. He would not do it. No. Think of what a scandal it would make. The police, they would be after him. He would have to fly, and where? Oh, the terror of being a fugitive from justice. He took out the 2 boxes and put all the money back. In his excitement, he forgot what he was doing and put the sums in the wrong boxes. As he pushed the door to, he thought he remembered doing it wrong and opened the door again. There were the 2 boxes mixed. He took them out and straightened the matter, but now the terror had gone. Why be afraid? While the money was in his hand, the lock clicked. It had sprung. Did he do it? He grabbed at the knob and pulled vigorously. It had closed. Heavens! He was in it for now, sure enough. The moment he realized that the safe was locked for a surety, the sweat burst out upon his brow and he trembled violently. He looked about him and decided instantly. There is no delaying now. Supposing I do lay it on the top, he said, and go away, they'll know who took it. I'm the last to close up. Besides, other things will happen. At once he became the man of action. I must get out of this, he thought. He hurried into his little room, took down his light overcoat and hat, locked his desk, and grabbed the satchel. He turned out all but one light and opened the door. He tried to put on his old assured air, but it was almost gone. He was repenting rapidly. I wish I hadn't done that, he said. That was a mistake. He walked steadily down the street, greeting a night watchman whom he knew who was trying doors. He must get out of the city, and that quickly. I wonder how the trains run, he thought. Instantly he pulled out his watch and looked. It was nearly 1:30. At the first drugstore he stopped, seeing a long-distance telephone booth inside. It was a famous drugstore and contained one of the first private telephone booths ever erected. I want to use your phone a minute, he said to the night clerk. The latter nodded. Give me 1643, he called to Central, after looking up the Michigan Central Depot number. Soon he got the ticket agent. How do the trains leave here for Detroit, he asked. The man explained the hours. No more tonight? Nothing with a sleeper. Yes, there is two, he added. There is a mail train out of here at 3 o'clock. All right, said Hurstwood. What time does that get to Detroit? He was thinking if he could only get there and cross the river into Canada, he could take his time about getting to Montreal. He was relieved to learn that it would reach there by noon. Mayhew won't open the safe till 9, he thought. They can't get on my track before noon. Then he thought of Carrie. With what speed he must get her if he got her at all. She would have to come along. He jumped into the nearest cab standing by. To Ogden Place, he said simply. I'll give you $1 more if you make good time. The cabbie beat his horse into a sort of imitation gallop, which was fairly fast, however. On the way, Hurstwood thought what to do. Reaching the number, he hurried up the steps and did not spare the bell in waking the servant. Is Mrs. Drouet in? He asked. Yes, said the astonished girl. Tell her to dress and come to the door at once. Her husband is in the hospital, injured, and wants to see her. The servant girl hurried upstairs, convinced by the man's strained and emphatic manner. What? Said Carrie, lighting the gas and searching for her clothes. Mr. Drouet is hurt and in the hospital. He wants to see you. The cab's downstairs. Carrie dressed very rapidly and soon appeared below, forgetting everything save the necessities. Drouet is hurt, said Hurstwood quickly. He wants to see you. Come quickly. Carrie was so bewildered that she swallowed the whole story. Get in, said Hurstwood, helping her and jumping after. The cabbie began to turn the horse around. Michigan Central Depot, he said, standing up and speaking so low that Carrie could not hear. As fast as you can go.